shadows in the VFW hall seemed to dance and writhe across Jack Reeves's face as he lifted the tumbler of whiskey to his lips, the amber liquid catching what little light penetrated this forgotten corner. The other veterans gave him a wide berth, as if they could smell something on him that marked him as different, tainted. Perhaps they could. 3 tours in Afghanistan had taught Jack to read people, to sense when something wasn't right, when death hung in the air like a promise. But it was Utah that had broken him, not the war. His hands that had once field-stripped an M4 in complete darkness, that had steadied a sniper rifle through 72 sleepless hours tracking a high-value target, now trembled slightly against the glass. The ice cubes clinked a Morse code of distress that only he could translate. His ranger tattoo, once worn with unshakable pride, now felt like a brand of folly across his skin. A reminder that some enemies cannot be defeated by training, by courage, or by the most sophisticated weapons mankind has devised. "I was good at my job," he said to the man sitting across from him, his voice a gravelled whisper from too many cigarettes and too many screams, swallowed down in the darkness. "The best. That's why they chose me. That's why I'm still alive. The others..." His voice trailed off, and his eyes glazed over with the 1,000-yard stare that had become his constant companion. The interviewer, a man who introduced himself only as Phillips, leaned forward, his digital recorder capturing every word, every inflection, every hesitation. He'd interviewed witnesses to the strange and terrible before, but something about Reeves made his skin crawl in a way the others hadn't. Perhaps it was the absolute conviction in his eyes, or the way his fingers kept tracing invisible patterns on the table's scarred wood, as if warding off something only he could see approaching. "It was supposed to be straightforward," Jack continued, forcing the words out like they physically pained him. "High-value research site," they said. "Classified work. Need-to-know basis." The contract was too good to pass up. 3 times standard security rates, full benefits, housing provided. After my last tour, I needed something stable, something quiet. A bitter laugh escaped him, a sound like breaking glass. Quiet. Christ. The silence there was worse than any firefight I've ever been in. Jack's gaze drifted to the window, where twilight was beginning its slow transformation into night. His body tensed unconsciously, muscles coiling like springs, the old combat responses activating even here, hundreds of miles from that place. I didn't know it was Skinwalker Ranch until I arrived. The contract just listed coordinates, not a name. But I knew the moment I crossed the property line. You feel it, like walking through a membrane, like breaking the surface tension of some vast, dark water. The air tastes different there, smells different, like copper and rot and something older. Phillips nodded, saying nothing, knowing from experience that silence was the best prompt for a man struggling to tell a story he'd rather forget. Jack's eyes narrowed, focusing on something invisible beyond the interviewer's shoulder. They gave us a briefing when we arrived. Standard security protocols, perimeter checks, camera maintenance. The project director, Clark Doctor, Martin Clark. He kept it professional, technical. But there was something in his eyes, something tight around his mouth when he smiled, like a man trying to pretend everything's normal while standing in a burning house. The other guards were the first real warning sign, though Jack hadn't recognized it at the time. Cobb had served with Delta Force. Reynolds was ex-Marine Force Recon. Diaz had multiple Black Ops deployments that he'd never discussed. Not the kind of men who spooked easily. Not the kind of men who carried good luck charms or muttered prayers under their breath. Yet there they were. These hardened warriors, wearing strange symbols etched into leather bands around their wrists, hanging odd-smelling sachets in their quarters, painting lines of some reddish powder across their doorways and windowsills each night before sunset. Harrison was the worst, Jack said, his fingers now white-knuckled around his glass. British guy, former SS. 20 years of combat experience in places most people couldn't find on a map. Hard as nails. The kind of man who'd stitch his own wounds without flinching. He had a necklace made of bones. Small ones, rabbit or bird, I think. He never took it off, not even in the shower. Jack's breathing had quickened, and a thin sheen of sweat glistened on his forehead despite the room's chill. My first night patrol, Harrison insisted on walking me through the real protocols, not the ones in the manual, the ones that mattered. Never whistle after dark. Never respond if you hear your name called unless you can see who's calling. Never, under any circumstances, look too long at the shadows on the mesa, especially if they seem to be moving against the wind. And if the cattle start acting strange, all facing the same direction, silent, watching, get inside immediately, lock the doors, and wait for dawn. The interviewer shifted uncomfortably in his seat, feeling the temperature in the room seeming to drop as Jack spoke. I laughed at him. God help me, I actually laughed. Thought it was some kind of hazing ritual for the new guy. Jack's eyes locked with Philip's, and the interviewer felt something cold slide down his spine at what he saw there. Harrison didn't laugh back. He just looked at me with those dead eyes of his and said, "You'll learn, mate. We all did. The ones who didn't aren't here anymore." 3 weeks later, Harrison disappeared during a night patrol. We found his boots arranged neatly side by side in the middle of a field. Nothing else. Not a drop of blood. Not a scrap of clothing. Not a single footprint leading to or from where those boots sat. Just gone. That's when I started wearing an amulet too. Phillips poured another finger of whiskey into Jack's glass, noticing how the former ranger's eyes constantly darted to the windows as darkness settled outside. Jack took a long swallow before continuing, the liquor no longer burning, but instead a dull warmth that couldn't reach the cold place inside him. 2 weeks in, I had my first encounter, he said, his voice dropping so low that Phillips had to lean forward to hear. Standard perimeter check, just after sunset. I had Rex with me, Belgian Malinois, best patrol dog I'd ever worked with. That dog had faced Taliban fighters without flinching, had detected IEDs that would have turned our convoy into confetti. Nothing scared Rex. Jack's fingers traced the scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw, a habit he'd developed since returning from the ranch. We were near the southeast corner, where the property borders that strange mesa formation. My flashlight died without warning. Military grade, fresh batteries, shouldn't have happened. In that instant of darkness, I felt pressure, like the air itself had thickened, had weight. Then came the whispering, right behind me, so close I could feel breath on my neck. Words I couldn't understand, in a voice that didn't sound. He hesitated, searching for the right word. Didn't sound like it was made by a human throat. I spun around, sidearm drawn, but there was nothing. Just empty air, and the mesa looming against the stars. That's when I noticed Rex. A muscle in Jack's jaw tightened. He was frozen in place, hackles raised, but he wasn't growling, wasn't barking. He was trembling, whining high in his throat like a puppy. Then he just lay down in the dirt, put his head between his paws, and wouldn't move, wouldn't respond to commands. I had to carry him back to base, 80 pounds of muscle and bone suddenly reduced to a shivering mass. The next morning, Jack reported the incident to Dr. Clark, who dismissed it with practiced casualness that didn't reach his eyes. But Diaz, the quiet, intense former Black Ops specialist, cornered Jack in the mess hall later. "Found tracks, didn't you?" Diaz asked, his dark eyes unblinking. "Big ones. Don't fit any animal, you know." The certainty in his voice made Jack's blood run cold, because he hadn't told anyone about discovering those prints on his way back. Massive 5-toed impressions that looked almost human, but were too large, too deep, as if whatever made them weighed several hundred pounds. Most disturbing was how they appeared in a perfectly straight line, each exactly the same distance apart, then simply stopped in the middle of an open field of hard-packed dirt. They come and go as they please, Diaz continued, absently touching the strange amulet hanging from his neck. Barriers mean nothing to them. Physics means nothing to them. Jack wanted to dismiss it all, the superstition, the fear that hung over the compound like a fog, the way the other guards performed bizarre rituals before each shift. But that night, he found himself unable to sleep, his trained senses alert to something moving outside his window, something large that made no sound as it passed. When morning came, he discovered a perfect circle of dead grass around the barracks, as if something had paced there all night, around and around, looking for a way in. Reluctantly, he sought out Harrison, the cold-eyed Brit who'd first warned him. "You're starting to see now, aren't you?" Harrison said, not really a question. "Starting to feel it watching. There are rules here, unwritten ones. Never whistle at night. It draws them. Never dig in the soil. It wakes them. And never, under any circumstances, look too long at the shadows on the mesa, especially if they seem to be moving against the wind. That's them hunting, looking for weakness, looking for an invitation." It was the third week when everything changed, Jack said, his voice hollow as he stared into his drink. "I was monitoring the security feeds when I saw it, a heat signature crossing the main pasture. Too big for a person, moving too fast." He ran a hand over his face, fingers trembling slightly. "Cobb and Reynolds went with me to investigate. Real professionals, both of them. Cobb had this laugh that could fill a room, always telling stories about his kids. Reynolds was quieter, collected rare coins. Normal guys." Jack's voice cracked on the word normal. "We tracked it to the eastern field. Our tactical lights caught glimpses of something. Not a coyote, not a bear. It seemed to shift as we watched it, like its shape wasn't fixed. One moment wolf-like, the next standing upright with limbs too long, joints bending wrong." He took a ragged breath. "When it turned toward us, its eyes reflected red, not the green or yellow of an animal." Reynolds panicked, emptied his magazine. "The bullets hit it. I saw impact, but it just stood there. Then it made this sound like metal tearing, and our equipment went haywire. Cobb's night vision unit actually caught fire while still on his face. Then it charged us, moving impossibly fast. We scattered," Jack continued, eyes unfocused, reliving the moment. "But it wasn't hunting randomly. It went straight for Reynolds, like it remembered he'd shot it. We found him an hour later near the old ridge line. He was alive, technically, physically unharmed except for his eyes." Jack drained his glass in one swallow. They were just empty, staring at nothing. He hasn't spoken since. The official report says psychological break from stress. The ranch does that to people, they said. But I saw his face when we found him. It wasn't fear. It was like something had hollowed him out from the inside. Phillips leaned forward, captivated despite his growing unease. After that night, things escalated. We'd find our equipment sabotaged in ways that shouldn't be possible. Locked gun cases opened, weapons disassembled without triggering alarms. The cameras would record impossible things. Figures standing motionless for hours. Animals walking backward. Shadows moving against the light source. Dr. Clark started spending more time in his office, doors locked. We could hear him on the phone, arguing with someone about containment protocols and escalation thresholds. The research team, they knew more than they told us. They'd been tracking the phenomena, cataloguing them like they were studying some new species. After Reynolds, we understood we weren't just guarding a ranch. We were prey in a hunting ground, Jack said, his posture now rigid, military bearing reasserting itself as if preparing for combat. It wasn't random encounters anymore. It was systematic. Psychological warfare. He motioned for another drink, waiting until Phillips refilled his glass before continuing. Diaz heard his dead brother one night, calling from the darkness. Voice perfect, down to the nickname only family knew. Cobb started finding small arrangements of bones outside his door each morning, arranged in patterns that looked almost like written language. My dog Rex wouldn't leave the barracks, not for any command. Jack's knuckles whitened around his glass. Then Harrison disappeared. Night patrol near the old ridge. His radio transmission cut off mid-sentence, just static, then this sound like... He struggled for words, like wet meat being torn. We organized search teams, found nothing until dawn, just his boots placed side by side in the middle of a clearing. Perfectly aligned, like someone had just stepped out of them. No tracks leading to or from them. The ground around them was cold. Thermal imaging showed it 15 degrees colder than the surrounding soil. And there was a smell there. Something ancient and wrong, like time itself had gone rotten. That night something scratched at our windows, for hours. Not random, deliberate patterns, the same sequence repeated. And a voice, Harrison's voice, whispering through the glass. Jack's hand moved unconsciously to his amulet, now visible under his collar, begging us to let him in, saying he was cold, so cold. Phillips noted how the glass trembled in Jack's hand. Doctor. Clark locked himself in the research building after that. Whatever they were studying had evolved beyond their models, he said. We were on our own. The remaining security team rotated shifts. No one alone, no one outside after dark unless absolutely necessary. We rigged extra lights, motion sensors, thermal traps. None of it mattered. They dismantled everything, moved our equipment while we slept. We'd wake to find our weapons in different positions than we'd left them. Messages carved into walls, symbols none of us recognized except Diaz, who said he'd seen similar markings in caves in Afghanistan where his unit had found things. Jack stopped, swallowing hard. The most terrifying part wasn't what we saw. It was knowing we were being studied. That these entities were learning our patterns, our weaknesses. That they could take us any time, but were choosing not to. Yet. My last night at Skinwalker Ranch began with silence. Jack whispered, leaning forward, his face now drained of color. Not just quiet, complete absence of sound. The constant background noise of the desert just stopped. Even our breathing seemed muffled, like the air had thickened. He drew a shaking breath. Only 4 of us remained. Cobb, Diaz, myself, and Dr. Clark, who'd finally emerged from his research building, wild-eyed and clutching a metal case. The ranch animals had gone still, cattle standing in perfect circles, all facing inward, not moving, not blinking. At exactly midnight, every light failed simultaneously. Not just electrical, chemical flares, battery-powered flashlights, even the phosphorescent emergency strips. In that instant of perfect darkness, the temperature plummeted. Frost formed on the inside of our windows. Jack's voice dropped so low Phillips had to strain to hear. Through my night vision, I saw them coming. Not just from the ridge this time, from every direction. Some crawling on all fours, some walking upright. Some moving in ways nothing with a spine should move. They converged on the main house where we'd barricaded ourselves. Not rushing, not hurrying. They knew we had nowhere to go. That's when I saw it. The one in charge. It moved through the others, like smoke through solid objects. Darkness within darkness, a void that pulled at the eye. When it looked at me, I knew it could see through walls, through darkness. I felt it reach inside my mind. Tears welled in Jack's eyes. It showed me things, visions of what it had done across centuries, what it had been before this land had a name, what it would be long after humans were gone. Then it spoke, not with a voice but directly into my thoughts, in words that felt like razor blades. "You are temporary. We are forever." Jack's hand unconsciously touched the scar on his face. Diaz broke first, fired his weapon through the window. The glass, it didn't shatter outward. The fragments exploded inward, each shard moving with purpose, targeting his eyes, his mouth. Cobb and I tried to reach him, but the darkness itself seemed to solidify, holding us back. Dr. Clark opened his metal case. Inside was some kind of ancient stone tablet covered in symbols. He began reciting words that hurt to hear. For a moment the entities retreated, but then Jack's voice broke completely. The last thing I remember is the darkness flowing into Clark's mouth, his eyes, his ears, his body contorting as something else wore it. Then nothing until I woke up in a hospital bed 3 days later, 50 miles away, with no memory of how I'd escaped. They told me I was found walking along the highway, covered in symbols carved into my skin. He finished his drink with a trembling hand. I'm the only one who made it out, and sometimes, when I close my eyes, I know they're still watching, still waiting.